So if you follow my content, Moore's Law is dead, flyover states. In the future, who knows? Maybe there's some comedy channel or something I'm doing. It all seems to come down to, if you've noticed, things that other people aren't talking about. Maybe there's some issue everyone's discussing, and I go, why is everyone missing this big point? Or it's just a truth that I think everyone is ignoring. And that's a lot about what flyover states is for at this point. Eventually, as this grows, if I'm lucky enough to have this platform grow, just like Moore's Law is Dead did, I will talk more and more about current events. But like I said in the first main episode of Flyover States, I want to get some fundamental points out before I start giving opinions on things going on. I think getting on the same page is much more important than talking about the latest, debacle in politics. We need to be on the same page before we can even try to get on the, if we're not all on the same page as to how things work, what's up is up, if down is down. If we're not all on the same page on fundamental things, how can we ever talk about current events? So the first episode was about understanding kind of, I would say, the good side of Americanism, right? That I think a lot of people miss. This one's about misunderstanding almost what it means to be human. Now, of course, this is called The Benefits of Decentralization, or I think that's what the title will be called. I always decide at the last minute. And this is actually going to be organized into 3 different acts. To talk about decentralization, to talk about how society built itself, this is going to be broken into 3 main acts. 1, misunderstandings on how humans organize society in the first place. 2, growing decentralization of governments. And 3, benefits of being decentralized. Now, I know this sounds like almost like this could just be a college lecture. It's not going to be boring, guys. Stick with me here, all right? All right, so part 1, let's talk about how we even got here in the first place. A lot of people seem to think that the takeaway from history, the spark notes when it comes to government, is that as more technologies emerge, we become more efficient at centralizing power. And we aim to centralize power because as long as you can keep it honest, a centralized power is more efficient than tribes, right? That's what most people seem to think, I would say. But the truth is, it's really not that simple. And that opinion's actually founded on a lot of incorrect assessments of history. In many ways, I would actually argue the more you centralize, the less you accomplish. And it's actually not because of what you might think I would say, right? I'm not going to go on some libertarian rant. No. It's really just how humans act. That's why it becomes less efficient. Ideally, you want a balance between centralization. I'm not saying the opposite is true either, that the ultimate goal is to just become an anarchist. But anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to caveman times here. The way humans worked, and I mean like 100,000 years ago, right? When we were just hitting our stride as being humans and not being our ancestors. Humans naturally operated in groups of about 20 to 100 people, but it'd usually be closer to 20 to 30, 100,000 years ago. And we were hunter-gatherers. People would kind of organize themselves into what they're good at. Hey, this guy's great at running and throwing stuff. This woman here can see really well, really smart, and can organize. So maybe she's the one we should be following to pick out these plants. This person here seems to pick up on patterns on what makes you sick, what doesn't. They would be the quote-unquote healers, really early doctors. This guy here, he can carry a lot of stuff. Or, this woman over here happens to actually be the fastest runner in our group. She should run with the hunters. That wasn't unheard of. Women and men would generally organize into somewhat different roles. There would be women who would hunt. There would be men who would gather. And everyone knew each other. That's really how society organized. It's still how it organizes if you leave people alone, if you'll notice, too. But eventually, right, we organized into cities for agriculture. But it's not because it was easier. Throughout all my anthropology courses, what I was taught and what I studied directly was because, you can, as part of an anthropology course, you will actually look at real, findings of human remains from 30,000 years ago and go, this was here, that was there. Why were they doing this? When you actually look at the evidence, humans lived a pretty good life when they were hunter-gatherers. Granted, if you broke your arm, it could be life-threatening, although it usually wouldn't be. It would just be a gigantic issue. That's true. But assuming you didn't have any big pitfalls, you could live to be a really long time. Obviously, childbirth was also a giant problem. But when people say cavemen had a life expectancy of 40 years, it's very misleading. If you got past age about 10, the median age, right, which is more important, right, not the average, the median, half of your society, you had a 50-50 chance of getting to about age 60 or older. And that wasn't the case in agricultural cities. You did not live as long. And that's something we need to get out of the way. By about, 60,000 years ago, we had hunted out most of the great predators that were hunting us. There were still dire wolves as early as, I think, 5,000 years ago. Well, honestly, I think a few thousand years ago in Europe, there were still probably a couple. But for the most part, saber-tooths, these apex mega predators, were gone. We'd killed them all. So what was left? Not a whole lot that we couldn't eat. And there was so much food because there were so few people, right? You remove the predators, there will be more prey because they're not being hunted, meaning that we could basically prance around forests. And I'm not exaggerating. Early humans, right before the Ice Age, basically just did whatever they wanted. You'd have a tribe of 30 people prancing around. There was food growing everywhere. There was there was so much meat you could hunt, and that's because of how few people there were. It's a problem now, but as society grew, we had to organize to feed people. It wasn't because it was easier. The average day for a hunter-gatherer was really about 2 to 4 hours of working, and the rest was just kind of hanging out, frankly, having sex, talking to people, doing whatever you want. It was a pretty good life. But if you're a farmer, especially back then, 10,000 BC, you're working 12-hour days. You're following what the army tells you to do, or they'll kill you, and you're going to die at about 35. It was worse, but it was necessary. When you hunt out most of the forest, you need to have a king emerge, organize an army, and say, no more hunting. And when you need to switch to a plant-based diet, just because you literally have to, you can't move around as much. You're stuck in one place, you need irrigation, and you need a lot of organization. But it wasn't fun. It wasn't great. All those I don't want to get into some paleo war here, but all those constant nothing but carbs and such really wasn't that good for you. A lot of people had bone problems back then, lacks of calcium and vitamins you'd get from animals. It really wasn't great. This idea, right, that we moved to agriculture because it was easier is a complete fallacy. The real benefits of it were literally just that you can support a bigger population. That's pretty much it. And because you didn't move around as much, the few people who did get the good food could spend more time thinking and inventing. That's like 5% of the population. Whereas before, most people were happy. It was very unhappy times, honestly. Slavery was... It's almost missing the point, actually, back then to call it slavery, because everyone but the top 10% were slaves. So they really almost didn't even have a word for slaves. It was just accepted that some people were more valuable than others because they were at the top of the totem pole. That's it. That's just how things worked. But the reason I give you guys this crash anthropology course is really to tackle this ridiculous fallacy, right? Humans naturally are happiest in smaller tribes that, when necessary, join with a bunch of other tribes to accomplish goals. And it's not about being more efficient that we organized into larger states. It was just what was necessary. The only way you could feed those people. And the people who did support giant populations, like the Assyrians, well, then they just conquered everything, right? Because you have more people. It's really that simple. That's all it is. People's natural state really isn't to be socialist. Now, I'm not judging socialism as good or bad when I say that. I'm just saying that is not mankind's tendency. And in fact, when you look at people or cultures where people are into smaller, close-knit groups, not necessarily small towns, but smaller towns working together, the happiest societies on Earth, right, all available studies, are the ones where people are organizing themselves into smaller tribes of giant families, right? It is not the societies that are these mega collectives that always has led to unhappiness and is the least happy countries right now based on most studies. This is just a fact. Again, not necessarily saying good or bad, because you could certainly make arguments that there could be different goals than happiness. But that's not what humans tend to want to do. So let's just be clear about that. We want to be in tribes, and we only stopped being in tribes because we had to. Not because we wanted to or because it was better. Okay, so we've talked about how mankind became a society at all. Now let's go to recent history. Well, more recent than 10,000 BC. I'm now going 250 years ago. Founding of America. I don't know if America is on the decline. I don't know if it still has its best days ahead of it. Doesn't matter. No matter where America is, if it's still a country in 200 years, there's no doubt that history books will look at America as this insane moment in human history. This momentous occasion. And it did take the world by storm. I mean, really put yourself in the shoes of kings, not English ones. Let's say like a Prussian king in Europe when the United States emerged. Just hearing, oh, the colonies won. Oh, so England's mad, right? So who's the new king? Oh, there isn't one. Like, think about it. If you're in Europe, thousands of years of kings and queens, and you go, oh, so there's they probably go, so there's a queen, right? No, there's no queen or king. Yeah, and just how nuts it would sound. It's like, no, so they're like small countries, and I guess they're voting. No one even knew what to do with it. It really was an experiment. If you go back and read texts from the time, yeah, they were literally just looking at America and going, all right, well, get your popcorn. Let's at least see how this pans out. And they were right to be taken off guard because America took the world off guard. And anything could have made it not happen. A lot of it was luck, or some might say destiny, but like George Washington refused to be a king. That's insane. How many times have there been revolutions throughout human history? Thousands probably. And how often is the person, the leader, just goes, no, I don't want to be in charge. Never. How often, when there is a revolution, is the main, like, let's say state, England in this case, just mired in a war with another superpower, right? Britain was at war with France. Most of the time, they would have crushed the colonies, but they couldn't afford to. They were at war with France. And in fact, if France somehow had beaten England early, they probably would have just conquered America. But it was this ebb and flow mega war between Britain and France, as usual, by the way. And so America actually got some breathing space. Additionally, and this is a big one, the Dutch landed in the Americas, the French, the British. There were 13 different colonies. There wasn't one or two mega colonies. It's not like the English just landed in, Maine and then landed in North Carolina and then just said, yep, those are the two regions, and then they unite. No, if that would have happened, we might not have gotten a democracy either. The fact is, though, we had 13 different states with their own goals, and so they couldn't afford to trust each other. And this distrust is actually what made a system where there weren't as many bottlenecks that could fall apart. They were decentralized. Maybe a little too decentralized at first, to be fair with the Articles of Confederation. But the point is, if any one of these things wouldn't have happened, this experiment probably never would have happened, the American experiment. And real quick note, not saying it was all perfect. There were some horrible pitfalls and mistakes made. I will be doing an entire episode on slavery and misconceptions about the Founding Fathers. So don't worry, guys. That's just not the scope of this episode. Don't worry. I'm not just fanboying on America, but this is not what this episode's about. But anyways, back on subject. Had to say that. The point of me talking about America this much really is to illustrate how this perception that we're becoming more collectivized over time actually might not be true. History moves kind of like a pendulum. It moves in one direction, but it swings both ways while it's moving. I think people look back at the past 100 years and they go, a lot of people these days go, well, we're becoming more socialist because it's more efficient to centralize and streamline things from one place. And I'll cover that soon, the idea that it might be good or bad. But the idea that we are becoming more socialist over time, I'm not sure that's actually true. Again, not saying socialism is good or bad. I'm just saying I think people are thinking too recently. Take a step back. A large step back. Stop thinking about just your grandparents. Think about your great ancestors. So, in 10,000 BC, well, let's go farther back than that again, right? 60,000 BC, we had hunter-gatherers. There were some early cities around 50,000, but, there's probably one or two token cities before that as well, by the way. But for the most part, hunter-gatherers, 60,000. By 30,000, there were a decent amount of cities. Some small-scale wars. By 10,000, we do have some mega cultures emerging. I mean, I don't remember how old some of the most ancient Chinese and Hindu kingdoms were, but they go way back, guys. All right. So if we look, it's becoming more centralized then, but by necessity, as I pointed out earlier. And then we go from centralized mega dictatorships to feudal kingdoms, right? And that's after Rome, too, which Rome was a republic. That's less centralized already. Already, when we move past the 10,000 to 5,000 BC mega agricultural kingdoms, the Egyptians, Hindus, Chinese, and such, we're already getting to a few republics. In fact, the most powerful republic outside the United States in history, even by modern standards, the amount of land the Romans controlled was insane. They weren't as centralized. Yes, Rome was in charge. It was literally called the Roman Empire, one city. But there was a lot more governing going on. And that's because it's sustainable if it's decentralized. Keep moving forward, Rome collapses. But what emerges is actually a feudal society where, and I'll do a whole episode on this probably too, there were some benefits to smaller kingdoms that organized together. Think about it. Now, there were mega kings that would emerge, but for the most part, these were just alliances of families and smaller families and smaller families. This is more decentralized, actually, now than Rome. Even if there's more tyranny, arguably more of a class system than Rome had. And Rome had one hell of a class system, so that's saying a lot. If you really go and look at it, the feudal ages were more decentralized. You have to take a step back and think in terms of centuries, not in years, people. Okay. Now we get into the 1800s. You start getting more and more and more into these monarchies with parliament and colonies. This is more decentralized, people. We're not centralizing. We go to America, completely like a blueprint for trying out this idea of a completely decentralized government. United States. Just called the United States, guys. It's called that. That's where we're still at. I know in the past 50 years, there are different areas trying out different types of things like communism. But if you take a step back, we are becoming more decentralized. And that's because, as I argued, that's kind of how humans operate. We naturally want to decentralize. We naturally want to do whatever we want to do. So I don't know if we will become a mega socialist Earth, and maybe it'll be good if we do. Maybe we will work it out. But there's no evidence that that's the direction we're going in, people. No evidence at all. Okay, so we've talked about how mankind tends to organize itself, how we got to society in the first place. We then took a step back in Act 2 of this episode and said, what is the tendency? Are we becoming more collectivized or not? All right, well, let's move on to Act 3 here, which is going to be the hardest one for me to talk about because I want to stay objective. But let's do it. Let's try to make some points as to why you might actually want your utopia of the future to be more decentralized instead of a socialist utopia. Not to say a socialist utopia couldn't happen or wouldn't be ideal if we got it to work. Not what I'm saying. But let's not overlook the other side of this coin, people. No matter how you set up a system, no matter how many checks and balances you put in place, if there is one bottleneck, eventually it will be exploited by someone. That's just a given. Eventually it's going to happen. It might not be right away, but it does. It happens. Let's be honest, right? 10 years isn't a long time. 20 years isn't a long time. 50 years isn't a long time. If you look at, like, for instance, kings and queens of England, they had a lot of great kings and queens just in a row. Basically, now, certainly King Henry VIII wasn't a good family man, but England became very powerful under him. And outside of, well, I suppose one of his daughters, Queen Elizabeth, was pretty great. And the reign after Queen Elizabeth, you had a ton of great kings and queens. Of course, some bad ones, but it wouldn't be uncommon to have 1, 2, or even 3 monarchs in a row from the same family that were all great leaders. And that could be 200 years of great reign. So let's keep that in mind. That just a monarchy, while being horrible sometimes you get 200 golden years in a row. So if your system of government can't beat 200 years, it's probably a pretty goddamn awful system of government. And that brings me to communism. I see many people. I think some people go, oh, millennials this. Now, everyone always shits on the newest generation. There have been communist idealists in America and all over the world since it was invented, right? This isn't some new thing of young people. It's a tendency towards this. I get it. But it becomes a fetish, I believe. You fetishize communism because it's true on paper. If we all work together, things would be great. But it misses the point that that's not how humans work. And it often misses a point that drives me crazy. And that is, we have tried to make it work more than once. It's not like, oh, well, the Soviet Union doesn't count because they didn't do this right. China doesn't count. Every time we've tried communism, it ends in a spectacular explosion of oppression. We've tried it many, many times. We tried it in countless kingdoms that organized more socially. We tried it in the Soviet Union. We tried it in China. It was tried. I mean, almost any communist government becomes more democratic over time or it collapses. So we need to get that out of the way. The idea of I'll say communism or even hyper-socialism, because that is a thing too, where you're not quite communist. Even the peg below that. It never pans out. And if you point to any country in it right now and go, oh, well, that one is working. It's like, how old is that system of government? Because this is another thing people miss. France has been around for thousands of years. England's been around for, over thousands of years. Okay. But their system of government has not. France really wasn't a democracy until the 1900s, late 1800s at best. I mean, Napoleon kind of turned it into a republic, but it really wasn't a republic until after he was gone. He was basically a dictator. So that means if we actually look at a successive government, one that has had the same basic system for the longest time, it's the United States. The United States has lasted longer than basically any system of government. Even monarchies, I would say you can only count one family. And I guess monarchies are still number one because I'm pretty sure there are some in Japan and other parts of Asia where they did just have one bloodline last for thousands of years. So, monarchy has the best proven track record, unfortunately. But if you look at Rome and the United States, they gained the power the fastest without collapsing within 100 years. So, and if you can't make your system of government last more than 100 years, your system sucks. And we've tried communism a dozen times. But why did it fail? Right? Why? Well, it's the bottlenecks. Eventually, someone exploits all of the systems together and destroys himself by making everyone his enemy. And that will always be what happens. And I know it can become frustrating to look at, for instance, the United States, and you see one agency doing a thing and then another agency doing the opposite and go, oh my God, why can't they work together? But let's look at the opposite. For example, right now, Russia is a dictatorship. And if someone at the top of the Russian government wants you gone and they can't find a good way to kill you and cover it up, let's say, easy. They have direct control over the tax system as well, meaning they don't tax themselves and they can hide their own wealth abroad easily because, again, they control the whole system. So then they go, well, you know what? Tax laws are so convoluted, we'll just find one stupid loophole this guy forgot when he filed his taxes, and boom, he's in prison. And that's a playbook of Putin right there. He loves doing that because it makes a person look bad. And then you go, well, he went to jail because he didn't pay his taxes. So he did break the law, even though they rarely enforce any tax laws in Russia on purpose so that no one pays their taxes effectively, and then they can just exploit them when they want to. That's the problem with centralization right there. That's why sometimes the United States and some Western countries come off as so crazy, right? We come off as crazy people. I'll be honest. You'll have literally, as an example now, the President of the United States saying one thing, the CIA saying the other, and then the FBI saying another thing as well. It looks completely ineffective. But that ineffectiveness is its strength. It's because the President of the United States can't just point at you and say, get him for tax stuff. Because the IRS operates on its own. And I know it can become frustrating, right? When, like, people make fun of this, the IRS literally has a field in your taxes where if you don't want to, I mean, some would say if you can't justify or can't remember, but really what it's about is if you did something illegal and made money, what the IRS wants is for you to pay your percentage of taxes. You made this much income, you're in this bracket, pay your taxes. And so they have a field where you can just say it was basically I did illegal stuff. And that's it, though. As long as you pay your taxes, the IRS will probably leave you alone. It's up to the FBI to open a case against you and make them do something. That's decentralization. You don't want that. You don't want the FBI to be able to point the IRS like a missile whenever they want to. You want there to be some checks and balances. You don't want, right, the CIA is supposed to operate abroad. You don't want them in a lot of countries, there is no CIA and FBI equivalent. It's just one hybridized FBI CIA. But what does that mean? Who's keeping them under control? That leads to a lot of police states. The ISI in Pakistan is pretty terrifying for that reason. There's checks and balances. The FBI gets out of control, the CIA can attack them, and vice versa. There's also the Secret Service, their own group, and the Army is separate from that. Again, in a lot of countries, the Army, CIA, FBI are just one giant mega unit, and it leads to a lot of military dictatorships. I know it's ineffective. I know it's annoying, but when you decentralize the bottlenecks, if one breaks, the others don't. And that's really the main point of this. Understanding that as ineffective as it looks, think about it, though. Do you really want one? Can you ever Can you ever make a system with enough checks, or should I say, enough oversight internally to make sure someone at the top isn't corrupt? You never really can. So you've just got to make agencies and groups that only worry about one thing and that one thing only. IRS wants you to pay your taxes, but they're not going to arrest you for selling drugs. That is the FBI's job. And when you look at how ridiculous the United States seems to be acting right now, I would highlight the executive branch was never meant to be this powerful. Congress is supposed to declare war, not the president. And this misbalance is probably the source of a lot of problems. And it just scares me, honestly, going off script here. It just scares me when I see people suggest making the branch even more powerful. For example, a lot of people like Obama, definitely a popular president, and they made him insanely powerful. Congress gave him a ton of power. They completely and utterly made the executive branch more powerful. But it's because he was in charge. So they said, well, but he's a good guy. Well, now how does it look? Probably regret giving that power, don't some of you? And on the other side as well, when they gave George Bush even more powers before Obama. There's this cascading series of presidents, maybe with the exception of this one where there's finally some pushback, where people keep giving one branch more power. Or arguably, for their own party's sake, you'll have people in the legislative branch literally giving up power to the executive branch because it's their guy in the office. That's where a lot of these problems are probably coming from, people, is that we are more centralized now. Maybe. I don't know. Just went off script there because I want you guys to think. I just hope people are thinking about that stuff. So let me be clear about one thing, too. What you're listening to is not necessarily what I believe should happen, will happen, would be best to happen. I'm just making an argument I don't hear enough. I'm one of those guys that will sometimes take sides of arguments I don't actually agree with because I think it might be fun to try to win on the wrong side. It's sometimes fun to just take a side of a debate you don't usually take just to try out new ideas. And I do that. I love trying out new ideas, letting them percolate, throwing them around in my head, seeing, maybe, let me see. Let me just try to be a communist for a day. See if I think this makes any sense, that type of stuff. And I don't think enough people are making intelligent arguments based on facts when it comes to libertarianism right now. And that's why I made this episode. I don't know if the future will be more socialist or not. Maybe we will make a socialist utopia. That's fine. But spend more time thinking about if that is ideal, if it's even possible. After all, when you make a system of government, it is completely ridiculous to make an excuse like, well, humans were too greedy or this or that. Yeah, your system of government is meant to govern humans. So if it's bad at governing humans, what is this, a system? Were you planning one for, I don't know, ferrets or aliens on, Marglar 7? We're talking about humans. And humans like to organize themselves into small tribes. Humans like to work together for small goals rarely, but they like to do it when they have to. But I think there may be a problem with the mindset that the ultimate goal of mankind in terms of governmental systems is to use new technology to make a more collectivized system of governments work more easily so we can make a bigger and bigger government. In fact, technology has been allowing us to possibly do the opposite. The goal should therefore possibly be to make a decentralized decision-making process more efficient, not the other way around. If you look at history, humans want to be decentralized. So ideally, shouldn't we be? I mean, that's how we evolved. Again, it may not be the case for aliens on some other planet, but we're humans. Let's stop pretending we should try to not be human, because in the grand scope of history, that's never seemed to pan out. But hopefully you enjoyed that. I mean, maybe socialism, as I said, will be the dominant form of government. Maybe we will have a socialist utopia. But at least you see the other side now, whether it's right or wrong. And the other side, hopefully, wasn't just some crazy anarchist ranting about his taxes. That's all I seem to hear out of libertarians in the U.S. these days. Flyover States, Political Views Across the U.S. is brought to you by me, Tom, of Moore's Law is Dead and Flyover States. If you like my content, please consider supporting me on Patreon. You can find Flyover States there, and there will be a link in the description. I don't have any fancy tiers or goals, just the assumption that if you like my content, you'll pay me for what it's worth. That's all it's there for. It really does go a long way.